August 4th, 2009. My name is Julian Reitman, and it's my pleasure to interview today Ernest Fanwick at his home in Stamford as part of the Oral History Project of the Jewish Historical Society of Lower Fairfield County. And I've been looking forward to do this day.
You're okay.
Okay, Ernie, we'll say good afternoon. And since this is for the Jewish Historical Society, and we're hoping that in 20 years people will be interested in what you say, I thought that it would be nice to start with your Jewish background. So whether you wanted to start with your parents, your grandparents, or yourself, I thought it'd be an interesting way to begin.
Our Jewish background was always represented by being born in Brooklyn. In an 8-block area, we had one family living who was Catholic. Everybody else was Jewish. In public school, I went through 6th grade without having anybody in the class who wasn't Jewish. In 7th grade, a girl moved in from Europe and wore pleated skirts when everybody else had to wear uniforms with plain blue skirts. But she was from France and made quite a stir, partly because she wasn't Jewish. Our schools would close, the neighborhood would close. Like most of the people in Brooklyn, we did not belong to a synagogue as members, and you attended on the high holidays. In fact, for many years, we shared a house with an uncle of mine who was quite Orthodox, and he attended a shul, which was in the cellar of one of the houses, where I was bar mitzvahed, and I didn't understand a single word from the minute I walked into that room until I left. Of course, we had to go to Hebrew school from the time you were 8 years old. You went 4 days, 5 days a week, including Sunday, and the teacher was an old man with a beard who spit into his handkerchief every time he had to do something. I didn't understand a word of what I said or what he said. Obviously, you only read the prayer books. You never read any modern Hebrew. So you were always conscious you were Jewish. There was never a question about that. We kept, for a couple of years, my mother would keep modified kosher. We always ate out in the restaurants. And toward the latter years, she didn't even bother keeping kosher. My dad, on the other hand, grew up, didn't speak a word of anything except Yiddish until he went to kindergarten, at which point he had to learn English. In those days, you sank or swam, and he learned English, of course. Although all his life he was considered a Yiddish scholar because he had a great vocabulary in Yiddish and would read the Yiddish papers as all of his siblings did. Yiddish was, I would say, their common language until they were probably in college. And to this day, they would, or till the last day, they would speak Yiddish within the house. Generally, to keep the children from knowing what was going on. Every other week, we would have Sunday dinner at my grandparents' house, where again, Yiddish was the common language. Pinochle was the common occupation. And since we lived 1 block from Evansfield, or they lived 1 block from Evansfield, we always had a box there, and the youngest aunt always had to take the kids to Evansfield, except when the Giants played the Dodgers. Then all the men went, and the kids had to stay home. But Judaism was never an element. We were never challenged being Jews. We were Jews. There was no anti-Semitism. The schools were closed on all the Jewish holidays, so that was taken as a common factor. The butchers, I can't remember a butcher anywhere in our area that wasn't a kosher butcher. You had the expensive kosher butchers and the cheaper kosher butchers, but you couldn't buy an unkosher piece of meat even if you wanted to, that I can think of. We had delicatessens, which were of course always Jewish delicatessens. We had appetizing stores. You notice Gus's Pickles just moved down to Brooklyn. So I'd say the Jewish influence on me was living in a Brooklyn Jewish neighborhood, always. Got to college, or ultimately got to college as a civilian, which would be after World War II.
No, how was it to transition into the service?
All right, we went to, my folks bought a home in a depression. Well, you gotta go back to my dad. My dad graduated dental school. What's interesting, from a Jewish history point of view, my grandfather had a dress manufacturing company called the OK Shirtwaist Manufacturing Company. And he only produced one dress. It was a black standard dress that sold year after year. Some years he had a good year. If he had a good year, the kids were spoiled. If he had a bad year, they went out and worked. But one year, the dresses were all returned because they said they didn't fit, except from Paterson, New Jersey. Paterson, New Jersey kept reordering dresses, and they went to find out why. And as it turned out, the Paterson women were, shall we say, overweight, and these dresses were cut wrong, but they fit the overweight woman perfectly. So to distinguish in his inventory, he called these half sizes. And he, in fact, was the first one to produce half sizes. My dad graduated dental school, and he had to go to dental school because the eldest son, excuse me, became a doctor, lawyer, or dentist. He chose dental school and went to what is now NYU, was New York Dental School at the time. Graduated in 1917 and joined the Army and was sent to Georgia, where the camp was all black soldiers but all white officers. 7 dentists in the dental clinic. He was the white one with 5 others, and there was 1 black dentist. Obviously, the white dentists weren't allowed to work on the black soldiers and vice versa. So the white dentist would play golf 5 days a week, serve 1 day, and he went and helped the black dentist, and he said he learned more about dentistry in 3 months than anybody could learn in many years. My dad was always a socialist, voted only for Eugene V. Debs and Norman Thomas until the 3rd term of Roosevelt, and was always proud of being what he called a socialist, not a communist, but a socialist. And it showed up when he helped the black soldiers, I think. But getting back to graduating, we bought a home. From the dentistry, he hated dentistry. He went into the dress business with my grandfather, didn't like that, and came up with the idea of dental malpractice. Up until then, the insurance companies were trying to create malpractice insurance for both the dentists and the doctors, and they hit stone walls. The dentists would say, we don't want you to settle these cases because it affects our reputation. You settle the case, we'll never get any patients. On the other hand, the dentist said, well, we want control, and the insurance company said, no, we gotta have control. My dad came up with the idea of having an insurance committee made up of the dentists, in which the insurance company would make the presentation and the dentist would authorize, the committee would authorize or not authorize. The dentist then realizes that their own people were tougher on them than the insurance company would ever be, because they knew when they screwed up. And as a result, my dad insured every Jewish dentist in New York, which was about 60% of them. They were never allowed to join the American Dental Association. There was a American Dental Association, which was all non-Jewish, the Allied Dental Council, which was all Jewish. They ultimately merged on the condition that each one would appoint the president alternate years. But because my dad was in the insurance business, we were able to buy a home just about 1934, when it was most unusual to have money in. Actually, our relatives moved into the cellar, which was furnished. We had aunts and uncles floating in there all the time because of the Depression. But we were the rich kid on the block, bought the home, of course in Brooklyn, where we had always lived. And it was across the street from Tilden High School, or up the block from Tilden High School. Of course, my folks didn't want us to have to travel to school, which was very common. You had no school buses. You bought a home near the public school or junior high school or what have you. Even though they wanted us to go to Tilden, both my brother and I ended up at Boys High. We were both more interested in math than we were in languages, and Boys High was the place to go when you wanted math. You had Brooklyn Tech, which was a little downgraded because it wasn't academic, and you had the Bronx School of Science, which was, again, a non-neighborhood school that you had to take an exam to get into and was highly regarded, and Stuyvesant and Boys High. In Brooklyn, it was Boys High or Brooklyn Tech, and most of the guys went to Boys High. Got out of Boys High, I graduated Boys High. I was actually 15, but I stayed on an extra year because my brother had gone to Cornell at 15 and was very unhappy there, and he insisted I stay the extra year. And I got out of there and I went to Brooklyn College. Brooklyn College, the Army came up with a program where if you joined the reserves, they would send you to school. After you finished your school, or when you became 17, actually, 17 or 18, I think, no, I guess when you were 43, I was 17. So when you became 18, you would go into the infantry, take the regular infantry, which I did after they sent me to Syracuse University, a branch which was in Auburn, New York. And of course we had our own classes, and we were, at that time, about 1,200 of us left New York. It was a competitive exam you took. Of the 1,200, I would guess 1,150 were Jews from New York City, and 50 of them were outcasts. We got to Syracuse. Each year they would drop some of us out, and we ended up at Fort McClellan, which was the infantry basic camp. Went through infantry basic for the 3 months in the summertime, and then I got reassigned with about 550 of us, got reassigned to Penn State. It was Penn State College. We all thought it was in Philadelphia, which was the University of Pennsylvania. And when the train went past, there were troop trains in those days, they never told you where you were going. It went past Philadelphia, we absolutely couldn't figure out what was happening, and then it started west again, and we were sure the train was lost. But we did end up at Penn State. At the first initial year, it was 550, and they gave us the electrical engineering course. We dropped about 50 people the first semester. Second semester, about 50 people. There were 4 semesters left. And the sixth semester, or the next semester, they asked us to volunteer to go to Tennessee to work on an electrical project. So we were all electrical engineers. We thought it was the TVA. And a number of guys volunteered to go. Not me. I did not volunteer for that. I wanted to finish school as much as we could. And all we ever heard from these guys was they wrote back and said they were watching a meter, and they pushed a button when the meter went into the red, and if it went into the green, they pushed the other button. And they couldn't understand it. Well, the sixth of the 7 semesters, the sixth semester, the end of the sixth semester, D-Day came, and all the guys were picked and went to Italy. 50 of us remained. Again, we have no idea how they picked us, but by name or how, but we ended up with 50 of us. Ultimately graduated and was assigned to the Signal Corps. Went to Fort Monmouth, where they made us go to radio repair school, which was great. Went home weekends. Radio repair school was moved to Camp Crowder, Missouri. So I quickly volunteered for anything that was left at Fort Monmouth. And it was actually the paratroopers that was the first one that you could volunteer for. And when I got interviewed, they said, "What the hell are you going to the paratroopers for? Why don't you go to OCS?" I said, "What commitment do I have to make?" They said, "No commitment." I had enough points to get out, but I went to OCS, and while in OCS at Fort Monmouth, wrote to the schools I had gone to, Brooklyn, Syracuse, and Penn State, and said, fine, I don't want to know anything except how much more do I have to attend to get my degree. And it was difficult because our semesters were 12 weeks long. The civilian ones were 16. So they didn't give us full credit for everything, but they wouldn't let us repeat the courses. And Penn State came in and said, we can do it in a year. Well, everybody else wanted a year and a half. They wanted 3 semesters. So I said, fine, I'm going to Penn State. I graduated OCS, or just about to graduate. And then told Penn State I'd attend. They said, oh, no, we meant next year. We have no room this year. You applied too late. At the same time, at OCS, they asked for volunteers to go to China. I had an uncle who left Boys High when he was 17 and joined the Navy right after World War I. He spent about 12 years in China and loved it, and always told me, if you ever get a chance to go to China, go there. They all know me. His name was Zenson. We called him Zuski, but there they called him Flanagan. And he said, go into any bar along the Strand or Shanghai and just tell Flanagan sent you, you'll get a free beer. And it was true. When I got there, it was true. But I volunteered, and a friend of mine volunteered, and we were not given leave after going to OCS. We were given priority travel to the West Coast to meet another plane there to take us supposedly to China. In fact, I had to bump a general off a plane, and if you ever heard cursing, and he had a lower priority, and they pushed us on the plane. But one interesting thing there, is I always call it the most embarrassing moment in my life. A man next to me in OCS was Francis English, was his name. So English and Fanwick were always together in alphabetical order, and we were very good friends. His father was a brigadier general in the Chemical Corps. And when we found out we had to go to San Francisco to catch the plane, he was elated. He said, oh, I've been in San Francisco. I know all the girls out there. We'll have one hell of a time. And we got there, and he got us a date, a very nice girl. And where do you go in San Francisco? You go to Top of the Mart. Now, I had a uniform on. I'll never forget it. It cost me $300. I never knew you spent $300 for clothes. For one clothing particularly, I couldn't even afford an overcoat. I had to borrow one. Well, we got to Frisco. We go to the Top of the Mart. And of course, there's a line with the maitre d' there, and the general had made us reservations. And of course, we get to the head of the line, reservations for Lieutenant English. Oh, yes, yes. And he looked at me and said, how old are you? Oh, no, I see your identification card. Show him my identification. You're not old enough to get in here. And I mean, he let that, so everybody in the place knew it. So Lee has never been to the Top of the Mart. I won't go back there on a bet. But we ended up going across the Pacific Island, hopping, hitting Philippines during a tornado or whatever they call them on the west, and ended up Shanghai. From Shanghai we went to Beijing. Beijing, I was the radio officer for what they called executive headquarters. Executive headquarters was set up by General Marshall when he was a civilian to bring peace to China and bring peace between the communists and the nationalists. I was the radio officer. Next door to me was Chow En-lai's office. He was the representative of the communists. General Byrode, which was Marshall's son-in-law, was our commanding officer, and Chiang Kai-shek's son-in-law was the nationalist representative. I spent about 3-4 months in headquarters as a radio officer, and we had teams all over China to stop the fighting. If the fighting started, they were to bring peace by getting the two sides together. And the next 3 months I spent going all over China as one of these mobile teams. Then got reassigned to the team that was stationed in Qingdao, and their responsibility was to take care of the port. Qingdao is the port, and guard the railroad line between Qingdao and Sinan, which was in the west at 150 miles. The 7th Fleet was the home base was Qingdao. In the whole area, our team consisted of a colonel, myself as a lieutenant, 2 enlisted men, and we'd have 3 radio operators. Generally, they were Italian Marines. The Italian Marines were left there. Italy couldn't afford to take them home. They never knew which side they were on, but presumably they were our allies at the end. But they were great radio operators, and they would operate our radio, and when they spoke Italian, they would go very fast. When they had to use English, it was a much slower speed. They never found out I couldn't read them. But when I'd hear the speed, I would accuse them of doing it, and they agreed. But that was just an aside. The 7th Fleet, the Army required a liaison officer to the 7th Fleet. Well, the colonel wasn't going to work, so guess who got appointed? I was the only other military officer in the area. So I became liaison officer to the 7th Fleet, which is the brigadier general's job to the 7th Fleet. And we had, the main job we had was keeping peace between our Navy and MacArthur's Navy. MacArthur had his own Navy to repatriate the Chinese from Japan back to China, and the Japanese from China back to Japan. And the Americans, we had the American Marine 1st Division, was sent there to protect us. That is, they were the fighting arm. What's interesting is I just found out the work of executive headquarters was just declassified. Up until now, when you went on the internet, you didn't find anything on it. It was unheard of. The reason, I gather, was because our final result was to blame the communists for the failure of the peace. And the reason was very simple. We had enough equipment to equip divisions, brand new equipment, sitting in lots, waiting for this peace to happen. They agreed on everything, a legislature, an army, post office, you name it. But the agreement on the army, the nationalists insisted that there be 1 communist battalion for every 2 nationalists. And the 2-to-1 was the ratio that we used all over. The communists insisted that there be 2 divisions to 1 communist division. And that's what broke up the whole peace talk. And it was explained to me that it was very valid because a division can operate on its own. A battalion cannot. A battalion doesn't have enough support. The nationalists were afraid of. They would equip this division, and here we go.
And in all of this, did you have Jewish contact? Were there any Jewish chaplains?
The Jewish chaplain we had, when we got to Qingdao, there was a restaurant there. Qingdao had a racetrack which the carriage horses would run every night. And there was a restaurant we went to, and it was Russian. The Russians had a tremendous area there where they used their own rubles. They used everything by themselves. When we came and we used the barbershop and the cleaner, we brought fresh money in, and we were heroes. But their restaurant, we went into the restaurant, and they had cabbage soup, which was a specialty of my mother's, and they brought out a meat cabbage soup. Well, to me, that wasn't cabbage soup. A borscht, they called it borscht. To me, borscht was beets, but this was a meat borscht. And maitre d' came over, the owner came over to greet us, see what he knew for us, and he spoke perfect English. Said, well, these people were all white Russians that had left Russia during the revolution and came to China and lived there as a group. And he said that he learned his English in New York. He had gone and lived in the Bronx for many years before they caught up with him and kicked him out. So to that extent, they weren't really Jewish. They were white Russians, and there was no synagogue or anything. Beijing had no synagogue. There was really no Jewish contact in the army. Got out of the army, went back to Penn State, got active in Hillel. Ultimately got the Hillel Presidential Award. And my job was to raise funds. So they would send me around Pennsylvania to speak to the B'nai B'rith groups and have the B'nai B'rith groups contribute a bigger portion to the Hillel at Penn State. At Hillel, I met Lee, and she got her Mrs. degree. It was a tough operation from, I got my engineering degree at Penn State, and then applied to law school. Applied to law school for one reason, basically. I had 3.5 years of GI Bill left, and I couldn't see that going to waste. My dad kept insisting, if you're going to go to law school, only apply to the good ones. Don't even think of going to a bad one. You go to the good ones or you don't go. The law school aptitude test was the very first time it was given was when I applied to law school and had to take it. Unfortunately, I had to take it on a Sunday, and all the people from Penn State and the surrounding area went to Bucknell on Sunday to take this exam, and the night before was a big prom dance. I got there I never forget it, during the course of the test, I fell asleep, and the proctor thought I was crazy, but I did fairly well on it, and Columbia accepted me. I applied to Columbia, Harvard, and Yale, and Harvard and Columbia accepted me. Yale didn't. Harvard, I'd have to live in a dorm. Columbia, I could live at home. At that point, we were living in Brighton. During the war, my folks had sold the house. We moved down to Brighton. The house we bought cost us $9,000. They sold it for $7,000. But we moved to Brighton to Columbia was an hour and a half subway ride, which was great because I could get all my reading done. And the biggest problem in law school is getting your reading done. And we got engaged after my first year in law school, but I told her we would not get married. I couldn't afford to get married until after I was out of law school. Graduated law school during the height of a recession, and there was no jobs available. What bothered me was dear old Columbia, who I hated. Columbia, like $30 a credit. You were allowed 15 credits in your first year, but only 12 in your other years. When I registered for my second year, they asked for $450. I said, but I'm only taking 12 credits, it's $360. And they said, no, they had a minimum of $450. Well, after much arguing with everybody, including the dean, I had to pay the $450. And I told them I would never give them another penny, and I haven't. Every time they ask for money, money goes to Penn State, where they charged me $50 tuition and an extra $75 because I was out of state. So it was a little different from the rates today. But getting out of Columbia, I had my engineering degree and wanted to make use of it, and really wanted to make use of it as a contract, in contract law. But the opportunity came at IT&T, offered me a job in their patent department. So I grabbed a job in the patent department and worked in their telecommunication laboratories. It was Federal Telecommunication Laboratories in Nutley, New Jersey. We had to wait a year in New York. In those days, I had to live in New York until the bar. I was past the bar, took the bar exam, passed it, but you then had to go before a character committee. And you had to be introduced to somebody on the character committee personally before you could go before. I didn't know anybody in the character committee. There was no Jews on it. And I spent 6 months trying to find out what to do until suddenly my uncle told me, oh, don't you know how to do that? And he called up on the phone, introduced himself as a lawyer to one of the members of the character committee, and said, now I'd like to introduce you to my nephew. And I got on the phone, hello, you're now introduced, you know him personally. And you go before the character committee. I did have trouble with the character committee because I had joined the, what was that? There was the American Legion, there was another AMVETS.
Yeah.
It wasn't AMVETS, I don't think. It was accused of being a communist organization. It was all the younger guys who didn't want it belong. But in Penn State, there were blue laws, and you couldn't drink beer on Sunday, you couldn't go to the movies, no restaurants. And in order to drink beer, you had to join one of the, either be a fraternity boy or join one of the veterans. I didn't want the American Legion, so I joined this AMVET. I think it was AMVET. In any event, when I got before the character committee, they wanted to know why I belonged to this communist organization. And I told them to drink beer. and they thought I was being very snotty, but they never heard of blue laws in Connecticut, in Pennsylvania. Okay, now I got out, I went to IT&T, started in their laboratory, of course, practiced patent law there for 5 years. Decided to leave there because IT&T owned the patents on all the instrument landing systems in the world. They had developed a new one, which did not require planes to fly in lanes. They could fly in any direction, know where they were. Not a GPS as we have today, but a completely different system. I did all the patent work on that system, and it was classified because it was used by the Air Force. It was classified, and by law, once it became unclassified, it was published. And if it was published, you couldn't apply for foreign patents. You would get your U.S. patent, but not the foreign ones. I came up with the idea of getting the military to have their people in each of the countries accept their application and file it the day the thing became unclassified. Well, after working on this for about 4 months, we finally got the Navy to agree that they would send it with their couriers, and it would stay classified until it was declassified. At that time, they would file it, or they would give it to our patent attorney, who would then file it in the patent office. And in order to do that, we had to translate our U.S. patents into all these different languages. But the translator had to be classified. He had to be cleared. Well, we found a cleared guy on Fifth Avenue who did about 130 languages. And we were interested in about 75 countries then, and there were about 40 languages we needed. And for example, Spanish, you could use Castilian Spanish, but you couldn't use the South American Spanish, and there was all kinds of rules. And I finally arranged to have this all done, and had to work literally day and night with, I don't know if you remember those purple things that we used to use to reproduce papers on,
Oh, yeah.
hectographs.
Yeah.
I had to reproduce everything in hectographs, hundreds of copies. I worked all night for a week. Finally got on the train, went down to Washington where we met an admiral, and he thought it was stupid. He wasn't going to do this. And all the arrangements we thought had been made. And I finally told the admiral that, well, you know, the government's going to have to pay for our losses. I see our losses in hundreds of millions of dollars. And you're going to be the one that's going to be named. He quickly changed his mind. We got everything all set. And this was a week of real horror for me. Got back on the train, the Pennsylvania train, went into the diner. And it was the Boston Express. I forgot what they called it. Boston Limited. And the main dish was beans, of course. And the guy next to me orders a steak. It's not on the menu, so I ordered a steak too. And I got back to Dudley, and one of the heads of the laboratory wanted to know why I spent so much money for dinner. In addition to that, I lost my parking spot. I had a parking spot because I worked at night and I needed one near the door. They said, I'm not working at night anymore, I don't need the parking spot. So I said, all right, I quit, that's it. And I got a job with ACF as their patent counsel. ACF Electronics was called Avion, and it was in charge of the guy who invented the bomb sight, the famous bomb sight. It had, the one he used in World War II.
Not the Norden side, no, it was a Sperry side.
Sperry sight.
Yeah.
But he was the co-inventor on it.
Okay.
But he was Swiss, spoke very poor English. So I and the accountant had to do the entertaining or the sales, but we had a great time. He then got the contract, we got the contract for the Sparrow missile, which was the first infrared missile invented by the Navy, actually. And we had the first contract for it, and we had to staff up, hire 100 engineers in no time. When we were fully staffed, they canceled the contract because one of the senators from Pennsylvania insisted it go to a Philadelphia place. We then had to get rid of all our engineers in no time flat, which we did fairly nicely. We had other companies come to our place and interview them, and it worked out fairly well. At that time, though, they had promoted me from patent attorney to division attorney, and I was doing very nicely there. But I had two friends who worked at Burndy, and I thought that Burndy's patent position stunk. And I told them, and they said, well, why don't you come up and don't tell us? Tell, in that case, the general, the Vice President General Counsel, George Zabad. So we had lunch together, and I showed him what I thought of their patent position and what they were doing with patents. And told me that they had a great deal of creativity at that time. They were really the first ones to have solderless connectors that worked. And he listened with patience and then said, you know, I'd like you to come work for us. I said, well, I'm very happy where I am now. We had bought a house in Dudley, and I was division counsel. I didn't have any real bosses. And he said, well, can I make you an offer? I said, of course you can make me an offer, but remember, my house, I used up my GI Bill on the house. I have to buy a new house here, and the commuting, blah, blah, blah. Well, he made me an offer that was more than I had anticipated, so we agreed. Then we had to sell our house, and somebody walked into the house and said he'd buy it at our asking price if we got out in a month. Well, nobody ever paid an asking price, so we rented a house in Bantam Lake, Connecticut for the summer. And while they were building the house we had on Rollingwood Drive, supposed to be ready in August. Came September, we had to get out of the Bantam house. They were closing for the winter. And that house still wasn't ready in September. So we went to Candlewood Lake for a couple of months. Then we ended up on Rollingwood Drive, where it was so muddy that our kids lost their shoes in the mud. But there, Lee was from a very orthodox home, where they kept kosher. Our father was I'd say cattleman. He raised cattle and had them slaughtered and sold them wholesale. And of course, always did it with a shochet. And they had stores in their hometown, but the Shenango Valley was a very active Jewish community. They had about 400, 500 Jewish families there. And one of the interesting things is that Irwin Miller keeps talking about one of the first settlers in Stamford was a man named Jacob Reuben, I have to ask me, Jacob somebody or other, who left Stamford and went to Sharon, where Lee is from, this small town, and opened a grocery store there, and now the family still lives there and runs the grocery store.
I think it was Rosenblum.
Rosenblum, yeah. It's funny, the connection. But she kept kosher all the time, and I couldn't care less. When we went to Nutley had one synagogue, which of course we joined. I quickly became treasurer. I found out because they never had enough money to pay the rabbi. So come April, you went around to all the stores in town, which were owned by the Jews, and asked for a donation so we could pay the rabbi until June. We also decided to build a new building there, and the guy in charge of it, who was apparently experienced, I said, we don't have any money. He says, don't worry, we dig a hole and we put one piece of steel up and we stop. He says, after that you'll have all the money you want. And it was true. He dug a hole, went around and said, we have no more money, we gotta put a fence around the hole, and the money poured in. I don't know what it was, I'm sure it wasn't even $250,000. But we then had a very nice shul on one of the main streets, and treasurer became a lot easier job. Stayed there, about 5 years, 6 years I guess, in Nutley, and then moved in 1957, moved into Stamford. Stamford, we went to join immediately to join a synagogue or temple, and we would consider ourselves conservative. So we went to Bethel. Bethel had a rabbi at the time. We went Friday night services, which were the big services, After services, not a single person came over to us to say hello, but the rabbi did. He came over and he wanted to know what I did for a living, and I told him I worked for Burnley. I didn't tell him I was a lawyer. When the man turned around in a complete about face, I never spoke to us again. I mean, I never saw such an obvious disappointment. We then went to a good Sholem, which I would call conservative in those days, as opposed to being really orthodox, and went to the Friday night services, and the Knightless came over and welcomed us and introduced us to the Langs and to the whole group that ultimately became the Couples Club. And the Couples Club was great. We had lots of fun there. Of course, made good friends. And to this day, keep up with many of the friends we made there. Became active in the synagogue, or Lee became active in the sisterhood, which was a little different at the time. Ultimately became president. I got on the board of directors of the synagogue and worked on many of the committees. Became president of the Couples Club at one point. Did all those things and was very active, much more so than today. Today we feel that well, at that time, Aaron Krantz was a very attractive rabbi. You don't find out these things until much later on. And I'm sure nobody else will give you a historical view that I can give you of them. Aaron Krantz, Milt Sanders, who now lives in Jersey, and I were on the finance committee and did an audit check and discovered a bank account in a bank that the shul had nothing to do with, in the name of the shul. And the only signatory on it was Rabbi Aaron Krantz. We were rather surprised by this. We went to the bank and asked the vice president, how come he opened this without a resolution? Well, of course, he had a resolution signed by Rabbi Aaron Krantz. I said, well, that's strange. He said, what do you want me to do, call your rabbi a liar? I became head of this cemetery, and there was $30,000 missing from the cemetery permanent perpetual care account. The rabbi said, yes, he took it because the synagogue needed money. They couldn't meet their budget, and that's where it was spent. What difference does it make? I pointed out the law is very clear on perpetual care funds, and you don't spend it to the shul budget. He didn't seem to give a damn about that. We used to think he was a terrific mensch because whenever the Couples Club had a party, he always paid his way. He always paid his way. It was only later that we found out he paid his way with charitable contributions made to the synagogue. He paid his UJF fund that way. It was rather horrible what was being done and what was done. Ultimately, the very Orthodox, or the more Orthodox members, decided to join their own shul, form their own shul, which is now Young Israel. And they were encouraged, actually, to do it, not because we wanted to lose them, because we felt that they would be happier with different kind of services and a more Orthodox atmosphere. When that happened, Aaron Krantz took great offense at it. And he went into Brooklyn and attracted young Orthodox couples to come to Stanford, telling them they wouldn't have to pay dues, they wouldn't have to pay a building fund. We just needed them for their Orthodox ways. And of course, that was the formation of the second service, if you want to call it, and the movement of Orthodox. When you went to them and asked them to pay the building fund, then we were promised. We were promised we wouldn't have to pay it. We couldn't argue with them. They moved up here and everything else. And of course, they were pushing the bicultural school that we had, what have you. So that's our story with the synagogue. We're not very happy with it now, but there's no place for us to go. And we have too much invested in it. Everything from the chandelier. The chandelier is an interesting story. When we built the new synagogue, there was no chandelier in the social hall. One of my Boy Scout friends, who convinced me to come to Burnley, by the way, but later.
Okay.
Well, the room had no chandelier, and my best friend was president of Light Lear. I asked him what he could do, and he said, well, let me see. And from the West Coast, he brought in two of his designers to come to our shul and look over what they could do in the creation of a chandelier. And I said I didn't want one of these crystal things, but he designed the one that's there now, which actually could have a third row in between. You could make it big or little. It became the basis for one of their lines because it was so flexible in what you could do. But the people started to hear we're putting up a chandelier. Half the congregation wanted a crystal one and half wanted neon signs. It got to be a hassle. What we did was we went to the sisterhood. We said, sisterhood, you give them the chandelier and we'll pay for it. And that's what, so the chandelier came from the sisterhood. Nobody could argue anymore. It wasn't an individual thing. We always had a problem in that shul that people come to the shul and say, I want this and I'll pay for it. And the board agrees to it. And mikveh is a perfect example. Nobody thinks how much the insurance is going to cost us, how much the upkeep is going to cost us, how much the water, heat is going to cost us, but it's being paid for, so nobody should complain. And I always use my can of red paint to show that I was going to paint red stripes in the synagogue. And it won't cost you anything, so don't worry, I'm going to paint it myself. And it's that stupidity that they have, where nobody questions anything. That's the issue. The next big argument we had with the shul was we had a cantor Cohen, who was beloved by the children. The children loved Cantor Cohen. Cantor Cohen was not the greatest driver. Once he hit 3 brand new Cadillacs being unloaded in Greenwich as he went along. But the kids loved him. Aaron Kranz, for some reason or other, wasn't loved by the children. And he was always jealous. When Cantor Cohen died, I asked the board of directors to put up a plaque in his honor. The board agreed. We went back, we designed a plaque that was similar to the plaques that are on the social hall for Hyman and Bennett, I guess, and the board approved. We then ordered it through the office. 6 months later, I said, where is this? Well, it hadn't been ordered yet. I said, why hasn't it been ordered? Well, Rabbi Aaron Kranz isn't sure he wants to have it. Well, of course, I went through the roof. 3 more months stalled, and Rabbi Aaron Kranz left, and Rabbi, whatever he was, came in. At the annual meeting, I got up and asked that a resolution be passed to put this plaque up. It was passed, and a rabbi came, a new rabbi, he was sorry, he didn't know anything about it, with PS. I told Rosie, when the plaque is ready, let me know so we can decide where it's to go. Rosie called me up and said, he's got the plaque, but it isn't quite what I ordered. And he said, then they already put it up. I said, oh, they did? And he told me where. I've since challenged all our members to tell me where that plaque is. The family of Sean Cohen tripled its size, and people still don't know where the heck it is. And one of the reasons is the dedication on there is it talks of how the children loved him, and that was too much. But actually, if you look, it's opposite the gift shop on the wall leading where the stairs are. There's a plaque to Sean Cohen with I think, a good tribute to him. And his family also put up the rest of it. Continuing. While in Stanford, I got active in the Jewish Family Services. I felt that that was an important element that should be expanded. It's an element that is a safety net. If you don't use it, it's great. But if you have to have it, it's the place to be. And the Federation and their allocations used to drive me up the wall. The allocations committee would be consisted of people who had kids in bicultural school or belonged to the JCC. Therefore, those two organizations were always number 1 and number 2, got anywhere to 4 to 5 times what the allocation of the family service was. When I would go up before the allocation committee, they would say, well, you only served 160 people. I'd say, well, how many people are served by the fire department, by the ambulance here. If you have an ambulance service, if they don't serve anybody, we're in pretty good shape. So it's the same thing for us, but they never saw it that way. I'll say this much, Matt Greenberg has now got a budget of $1.5 million compared to our $150,000 budget that we work with. So I think they're finally recognizing it. From working on the JFS, we went to the Association of Jewish Family and Children's Services, which is the overall national organization of JFSs for both US and Canada, and got very interested in their conventions and their activities. Ultimately worked my way onto the board. Without being too egotistical, I think I ultimately would have been president, which I wanted to be because they had representation on the Association of American Jewish Presidents in Washington, where that's where I wanted to go. But I got sick instead, and of course couldn't be active with them. I served on the board of directors. When we moved into Stanford, we immediately joined the JCC. We immediately joined the synagogue, of course.
Have you been active in non-Jewish community activities?
Yes, I was an alternate member of the Zoning Board of Appeals.
Okay.
And was one of the early members of the Senior Men's Association, which is probably the only place I can socialize with non-Jews. There's only about 20% Jews there. A few years ago, Ben Zimbarg, and from the association, the National Association of Jewish Family Services, I learned a couple of things about raising funds for charitable organizations. They were great pushers of the fact that the younger generation, or our children's generation and younger, were not giving annual gifts for charities to the extent that our generation and our previous generations did. And they pushed very early on the concept of endowment funds. They felt that the future of any Jewish charity had to be an endowment fund. Well, I came back and spoke to Ben Zimbarg and spoke to a lot of people about it and got nowhere. The next year, the Coastal Jewish Family Service serving Virginia Beach, that area, came back and said they had $7 million already in the endowment fund. Well, now we got very interested in it. Ben got a group of people together, Ben Zimbarg, and we formed the Jewish Endowment Society. Totally unsuccessful. We couldn't. For a year we did nothing, really was nothing. We decided we had to get a new executive for this. And again, quite funny, we interviewed the executive from Greenburgh or Dobbs Ferry, New York. My daughter was very active in the Dobbs Ferry synagogue, and he was president of it. And during the interview, I asked him if he knew my daughter. What's your daughter's name? I said, Leslie Fanwick. And a queer expression came over his face, and he said, I don't think so. Well, I immediately called my daughter. I thought, we really have a phony here, you know. I said, he says he's president of your organization, he doesn't know you? He says, what name did you use? I said, Leslie Fanwick. He said, well, I've been married for 20 years. It's Leslie Liz. Well, of course, he's been a real godsend to that organization. He's gotten whole communities around us to join, and I don't know what his number is, but it's quite extensive. What other? Lee is most active in Hadassah, and so I became a member of the National Board of Hadassah Associates and was active in that for a while.
Well, the question that then comes to mind, Ernie, is do you have any time for golf?
No, I don't play golf. We live next door to a golf course. But it's a problem. Not anymore, because now I'm far less active, obviously. Since I got sick, I guess, in 2002, I just haven't been that active, nor can I be. But it was a lot of fun while it lasted.
Yeah.
What I am active in now, you can shut the camera off.
Well, 1 minute. Before you do that, the other question was there any Jewish element in Burnley?
Yes, Burnley was founded by a man who called himself Bern Dibner. His real name was Dibnowski. I was probably the only one in the place who knew it because I had to have it for the record. But he, his brother-in-law, and his other brother-in-law, a man named Fried, founded the company. Bern Dibner created the first solderless connector. Had no money. He worked for Edison at the time. Edison, he presented it to Edison. Edison didn't want it. And he said, well, I think you're crazy. And he got his brother-in-law Fried to put up money to start Burnley. They started it in 24. And it was quite successful as they judged success of more sales every year. Almost everybody in the organization when I got there was a relative of Bern or his wife, except for this George Abad, who was their former lawyer on the outside. But everything from the engineers on down were almost all Jewish. And they were serving the utilities, which was most unusual. Finally, they got a vice president who wasn't Jewish, a man named DeMarsh, because we were selling the utilities and he was able to get a lot further than the former one. But it was treated as a small home company. When I got there, I'm trying to think what they were doing, $300,000 in business maybe. And we ended up on the New York Stock Exchange doing about 20 million. But the interesting thing about Burnley is in 1939-40, the War Production Board came to them and said, we need a solderless terminal. We want you to design and make a solderless terminal like the ones Chrysler used on the tanks. Chrysler used a tube of aluminum surrounded by a rubber tube from a medical organization and crimped through the rubber, which wasn't very successful. They tore the rubber. Well, we started out, came up with vinyl chloride. Now vinyl chloride, depending on the percentages, one way or the other, you can make it soft, you can make it hard, whatever you wanted. We came out with a good vinyl chloride and we were able to come up with this solderless connector. In '39, there was an upstart company called Aircraft Marine Products.
Amphenol.
AMP.
Okay.
Aircraft Marine Products. They were given the same task by the War Production Board to come up with a one. As things went out, we got a patent on thing. They got a patent and we put into interference. Interference, we won. We were in 7 interferences, we won every one. They then sued in court for their patents. They had different patents, which we weren't infringing. We had some 16 suits with them, one of which we did not win because we settled it. That one, the decision came down for them. So we were in court constantly with AMP. But AMP was, as one of the Wall Street people said, Burnley's the place to work, but AMP's the place to invest in. We used to have picnics where we gave out turkeys and kosher turkeys. It was real fun to work there.
Okay, before we wind up, and I thank you for your presentation, do you have any reflections on looking back and so on that you might say 20 years from now, some